Hi everyone. In the last video we discussed about income inequality. The goal of discussing income inequality was to think about how to measure it, although there are also policy reasons why we think it's important to think about why we measure it in the first place. To consider these reasons, there are also trade offs, potential tensions, and one area that potentially we could look at is economic activity. In an earlier video, Matt has discussed how we measure GDP or economic activity using available resources within the country's borders. In this video, we are going to discuss how we usefully can measure economic growth. So let's go. As noted in an earlier video, within an economy, there are a set of inputs or factors of production that can be combined to produce output. Although it's the output we value, given that we can consume and enjoy it, an understanding of how inputs combine to form this output allows us to consider how incomes are generated and distributed, and how much income could be generated overall. Growth in this context refers to an increase in the amount of output that is produced. This is an increase in GDP over time. In broad terms, there are two ways GDP may increase through time: an increase in the input used or a better use of current resources. On this channel, we would like to focus on measurement, as we believe all economic hypotheses should be transparent and testable. So, we would like a way to measure these concepts, and we would like to recognize where there would be shortcomings in the measures. In this case, the breakdown into more use and better use depends on how the inputs are measured. We can define our inputs as L for the labor input and K for the capital input. Typically, L is measured in terms of hours of work, while K is measured with respect to an estimate of the capital service provided by the stock of capital. The intention of both measures is to measure the quantity of the two inputs being utilized, not their quality. Given that, we can measure GDP in the following way: it's a function of the quantity of labor, capital, and natural resources that are used, and also a technology variable that represents knowledge and practices relating to the use of these inputs. To understand economic growth, we then need a way to decompose changes in economic activity through time into the use of these inputs and the residual term that is due to technology. The model that allows us to do so is termed as the solo growth model. One way we might generate growth is by having more people or using more natural resources. We can see that both of these things have been happening after all. However, the increase in production across the world far exceeds the increase in the number of people or the proportionate increase in natural resource use. As a result, we would look at our equation from earlier and say we are either using more capital inputs or that technology factor that implies we can make more from the same inputs must have risen. To consider both, we use a model called the solo growth model, or alternatively exogenous growth model. On the left-hand axis, we have GDP per person, and on the bottom axis, we have the amount of capital per person. We have seen GDP per person is rising by more than the growth in the population. And we want to understand if we can build a macroeconomic model that generates these results simply due to a buildup in the capital inputs that are used. Our first step in building this model is to work out our aggregate production function. In this orange curve, we are saying that the more capital stock there is per person, the more output will be produced. This makes a lot of sense, as more tools for workers will help them produce more. However, this curve increases at a decreasing rate. This implies that there is diminishing marginal product of capital. In other words, each additional capital item that is invested in can produce less output than the prior item. Again, this assumption makes sense as the more tool you provide workers, the less extra value they are likely to have, especially if you started with the best tools first. Although these assumptions are intuitive, in a macroeconomy, they are not necessarily true. But there is a topic for a future video, so stay tuned. For now, let's us assume that the aggregate production function does have diminishing marginal product of capital. As we are looking at the long run, we know that savings equals investments. Again, a topic for a future video, but just believe me for now. Assuming that on average people save a fixed share of their income, or for simplicity, then the savings rate times income is equal to the amount of savings, which equals the amount of investment. We can draw the following SY curve, which represents the amount of investment. Furthermore, we are looking at an economy where the population grows by some amount n over time. As a result, we require a line that represents how much investment will be needed to keep the capital stock per person the same. If we included the depreciation of physical capital, it would also appear in this line, but we will leave that to the side for now. So this is our model. Now, how can we utilize it? Let's pick a random size of the capital stock and see what's going on. At this point, we can see that there are three lines are crossed. The one at the top tells us the amount of output per person. But what do the next two tell us? The top one is the SY line. It is telling us that the amount of investment that takes place at the level of income that is defined by that capital stock. So the bottom one is the NK line that is telling us the investment that is necessary to keep the capital stock per person unchanged. As we can see, the realized amount of investment is higher than the amount that would leave the capital stock unchanged. So, the capital stock per person will begin to rise from this point on. It will keep rising until SY equals NK. At this point, the increase in the capital stock is equal to the population growth rate, and output per person stays unchanged. As a result, accumulation of capital did drive growth for a time, but eventually this stops and economic activity stops as well. So, but wait a second, this doesn't look like the graph of England that we just saw on screen. GDP per capita has been rising strongly for a long period of time. So, what's going on? Ultimately, it hasn't been increasing it hasn't been increasing use of inputs, labor, natural resources, and capital that has driven growth, but increasing technology. As a group, we have gotten better at managing processes, combining inputs, building large sustainable institutions, having and using ideas. All of these concepts are the residual term of the solo model, or what is called the A term, the technology term. This model is called the exogenous growth model as the main driver of growth. A is not explained in the model. So this tells us that something quite special has occurred. Society has become wealthier not because it has sharply increased the quantity of inputs it's using, but because it has gotten better at generating value from the inputs available. As a result, we want to understand this process. We want to make our growth model endogenous so that we know what determines our growth. But guess what? this is a discussion for another time. And thank you for watching us, and we'll see you again soon.